welcome to Mystic Dog Mama, the podcast for soul-led dog mamas, where you'll discover how to best nourish your dog and yourself, mind, body, and soul. I'm your host, Dr. Alexia Meller, a holistic canine nutrition and well-being consultant and the co-creator of the F.E.T.C.H framework. Along with my incredible colleague, Stacey Renfree, my aim is to help you feel less overwhelmed and more confident in taking a holistic approach to your dog's health through integrating evidence-based nutrition with spiritual wisdom. And speaking of my incredible colleague, today Stacey joins me for another F.E.T.C.H First Friday episode, where we take a topic of your choice and show you how we use our F.E.T.C.H framework in order to address it. If you aren't familiar with it, F.E.T.C.H is an acronym that stands for Fresh Food, Energetics, Targeted Approaches, Curiosity, and Holistic Health. These are the 5 keys that we have identified to supporting your dog's optimal health. And today, we're going to talk all things parasites and how you can use the F.E.T.C.H framework to help you decide the best way to support your dog. We are heading into spring here in the Northern Hemisphere, and that means fleas, ticks, worms, and mosquitoes are on every pet parent's mind. It also means that environmentalists grow increasingly concerned about the catastrophic environmental effects of the conventional pesticides used in the most common parasite preventatives that we pet parents are told to use. But what is a pet parent to do when all you want to do is keep your dog safe and healthy? Well, this is a conversation about parasites I promise you've never had before, but it's one that we need to have. We are in a collective paradigm shift. Whether you look at it astrologically, from human design, or you're just witnessing what is playing out in the 3D world around you, it's safe to say things are changing. And we are being invited to explore what no longer works and invite in a new way of being. That also includes how we approach parasites and how we approach our dog's healthcare. This conversation is for you if you feel sick to your stomach every time you give your dog their monthly wormer or flea and tick spot on, but you don't know what other options you have. It's also for you if you feel that you've tried the natural approach to parasite prevention and it hasn't worked for you. It's also for you if you are devastated by the environmental impacts of pharmaceutical toxins, but you love your dog and don't want them to get sick. And it's also for you if you're ready for a conversation that turns the whole parasite debate completely on its head. I'm talking approaching disease as dis-ease, taking an ecosystems approach to preventing illness, and, wait for it, approaching parasites with love. Yes, I did say that. I told you you've never heard a conversation like this, but stick with us because it will radically shift your entire approach to this hot topic. Stacey and I walk you through our approach to parasites through our F.E.T.C.H framework as a way of helping you make the best decisions for you and your dog. You are going to love this. I'll share with you at the end of this episode how you can pick up your own copy of our parasite prevention guide if you would like some help in deciding what the best course of action is for your particular circumstances, without the fear and guilt that often accompanies this decision, whichever side you're on. So stick around until the end. And if you enjoy this way of approaching your dog's health journey, I'll also share with you how you can join our F.E.T.C.H community and be surrounded by like-minded folks who want to integrate evidence-based nutrition with spiritual wisdom in order to create optimal health for their dogs and for themselves. Okay, on that note, let's go. Hi, Stace.
Hi, yeah. Oh, we're back again. It's March. How did that happen?
I have no idea. This year is just flying by, but you know what season it is now?
My
Parasite
favorite.
season!
Yeah, I was going to say it's my favorite. I mean, spring's my favorite season, not necessarily parasite season, but spring's my favorite season.
I love spring too, but I think for a lot of people, it's kind of that double-edged sword because it is when the parasite stuff starts to rear its head, and there's so much fear around what we're supposed to do with that and, all of that good stuff. So we decided that we were going to do our Fetch First Friday specifically on parasites, but we want to do it from a different perspective than perhaps you've normally experienced. From what we've seen, a lot of the discussions around parasites and what to do, it's rooted in a lot of fear. And from whatever camp you're coming from, right? Whatever perspective you're taking, there's a lot of fear that leaves. I know it has left me in the past as a pet parent, and it's left a lot of clients that I've worked with, a lot of listeners write in about this, that it leaves you feeling more confused, not knowing what to do, and feeling like whatever decision you make, there's still some element of fear and not knowing that you've actually made the right decision for your dog, and just overall feeling completely overwhelmed. So when Stacey and I were talking about how we wanted to approach this conversation with you all, we wanted to kind of flip all of this on its head and take a different approach, help you work through this in a way that is right for you and your dog using the F.E.T.C.H framework. So we'll be talking to you about that. But we also wanted to kind of embed the conversation with something that we talk about quite a bit, and we've talked about it within the membership space as well, which is something that we've taken from A Course in Miracles that for me is kind of a standout philosophy. It's been a guiding question when I start to feel overwhelmed and not knowing what to do, and all of like life stuff makes it hard to navigate, and I'm in a fearful state. Boiling things down to whether or not a decision that I'm making or the way that I'm thinking about something is driven by love or is it driven by fear? And if it's driven by fear, how can I show myself love and compassion? And also flip the way that I'm seeing something and ask myself, how could I approach this from love? And that's something that we want to do with you today around the whole parasite issue, as paradoxical as that might sound to you at first. But stick with us because I think you're going to get a lot out of this that will help you to feel much more empowered and in control, and as an advocate and confident of the decision that you decide to make, knowing that there is not one right way of approaching this as a kind of blanket statement, but you need to find what feels right for you, and we're going to help you to figure out what that is. So that's how we're setting
Yeah.
this up.
And I think in all the years I've been in this space, I haven't heard anyone having this discussion in this way. This is different, and I think it will help so many people just get a little bit more clarity around how they could do things.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
excited.
it's good. And that's ultimately what we're looking for, right? We tune into these things with like, well, what am I supposed to do? And I know it can feel a little like frustrating that there isn't just one thing to do, but I think the more that you learn how to navigate this from that perspective of you having the answers, and I don't mean that in a trite way, as it's often bounded around like, oh, the answers are all within you, but meaning they are, but and we're still trying to navigate like this
But how
3D.
do you get there?
How
That's
do
the
you get
thing.
there?
It's how do you get there? How do you make those decisions based on what works for you and what aligns for you?
Yeah,
And one of the things we're going to be talking about a lot during this is what your level of risk is as well. So where do you feel comfortable currently, and where might that change to, and just how that journey might look, and where you starting from, and what you might want to be working towards. But again, how do you do that? How do those steps get broken down into a different discussion than just all or nothing or one or the other?
absolutely. Absolutely. And also recognizing too that there is such an emotional charge and component to all of this as well. And I am very cognizant of the fact that people have had bad experiences with parasites in the past. Like you might even have Lyme disease yourself. Like, and so this is not about belittling or sort of ignoring risks. That there's a risk with everything. There's a risk with absolutely everything in life, right? But this is, how do you start to navigate your risks from a number of different perspectives and what you're comfortable with, and that will be informed by your past experiences as well. But maybe this will be an invitation for you to sit with some of that stuff and ask yourself, where am I at with all this right now? And what are some choices that I can be making? Again, not so much out of fear of what could happen and all that, but out of a loving space. And we'll talk to you about that, what that looks like practically. So shall we dive in?
Let's, because it's such a big one. We're going to try and be good and just not go on for hours.
It is. And we were just saying right before we started recording this too, like we could seriously be talking about this for 17 hours because there's so much to it. But what we really want to do is kind of dive into the meat of it and dive into specifically this other way of thinking about it. So you've got some core takeaways that you can be
Yeah.
leaving this episode with about some questions you might want to be asking yourself or your vet or any other practitioner, for example, to evaluate your own risk. But I
Yeah.
wanted to say as well, Stace, that you had mentioned, and this was sort of shocking to me as well. You said right before we started recording, you were like, "Isn't it crazy that this has really only been a thing? The whole pharmaceutical thing um, for kind of parasite prevention has really only been such a big issue since the 90s.
Yeah, I was
It's really
when I was
recent."
doing some research and just kind of just Googling and just because I was like, I don't remember doing this with like my dogs when I was a kid. So I was like, when did that kick in? And I didn't have did I? Yeah, I kind of had I was connected to a dog during the 90s, but early 90s, but not until Shadow in 2016. So there was a big gap when obviously the kind of culture had changed. So I hadn't really thought about that. So that's when I did a little bit of Google and research. And yeah, it's the 1990s. So we're talking 30 years where something has become so ingrained in our kind of psyche about how we protect our dogs. And I use that word in all the ways that it could be interpreted in terms of protection from parasites, but from a fear perspective rather than it coming from a space of love and somewhere else. But yeah, the 90s just blew my brain. I was
Yeah.
like, like 30 years of just that's nothing.
Yeah.
It's no time at all for it to become such an ingrained idea and like a monthly plan. Like, how did that happen?
Yeah. Well,
So, yeah.
to be fair, it's interesting too that it's not so dissimilar from the way that kibble became a kind of norm within roughly the same time period. I mean, it was like more the 70s and 80s, but still, like we're talking recent history that took over previous ways of kind of thinking about feeding our dogs and caring for our dogs. So it's really interesting. But the ramifications of these drugs, not only for our dogs but also for the wider environment, have really become so critical and have crossed over from the conversation specifically in the veterinary field into like environmental questions and questions around the impact on human health and fertility and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's timely that we're actually having this conversation from this other perspective too, of how do we evaluate all of this, not just for our individual dogs, but also how does this start to shape the way that we're thinking about the future of engaging with parasites for our dogs and the wider implications that
Mm.
has. But I wanted to kind of point something back to some things that you and I were talking about as in terms of how we're going to frame this conversation today as well, which was how there's sort of two philosophies around approaching parasites. And I wondered if you wanted to kind of talk a little bit about those two philosophies.
Yeah, I mean, you've got the two camps. You've got the farmer camp where we just want to kill everything and just annihilate everything because everything's bad. All of those things are bad. They're a threat to our dogs. They're a threat to their health and their well-being. So they just need to be gone. That we just need to get them out of there. But then you've got kind of the other side. But then again, I'd say maybe there's even three because then you've still got the side where you've got the kill everything, the kind of farmer camp. Then you've got the holistic camp that would probably say we just look at using natural alternatives. But then there's probably another little side as well where I'd say that there's those of us that would think about supporting the immune system and how do we build a healthy dog in the first place? Build, that's the wrong word, but how do we nourish a healthy
Yeah.
dog? That's the better phrase, I think. How do we nourish a healthy dog? So I think there's probably a few little sides to that. There's,
Yeah.
yeah, because it isn't just as simple as holistic or farmer. There are some other ones, and even things like managing the environment as well. And how do we do that to create that protection that we're all want, but it's how do we deliver that protection in
Mm-hmm.
which format? Whether we
Mm-hmm.
go the complete annihilation route or do we go with the kind of supporting the immune system and
Mm-hmm.
creating a healthy dog? It's a very
Yeah.
different conversation, both sides.
It's
Mm.
true. And actually there's to your point that there's sort of like multiple philosophies around this. This goes back to what we were just saying about needing to evaluate your particular risk, that there might be a combination factor, right? Like you might use some holistic stuff and some pharma stuff depending on the context or at certain times of the year or whatever. So it's not black and white or cut and dry, but I do think that the when we start to think about parasites and how you start to evaluate this as a pet parent, it's kind of figuring out which philosophy feels most right for you. What do you feel most aligned with is a starting point to then look at how do you evaluate the questions from that philosophy. So we'll present the different philosophies to you to kind of familiarize yourself with it, and then you can sort of see, well, what feels most resonant for me right now, and where are my kind of like, I guess, like, where are my concessions with things too? Like, where do I have to make where are my rubs that I might have to make a different decision about? And coming from it with this intention that you feel really confident about the decision that you're making because you've thought it through, you felt it through, which is another way of thinking about this stuff too, another way of approaching it. How do we feel like from an energetic space as well? And that you're armed with the right questions to ask the various professionals that can help guide you through this, rather than just ascribing to somebody else's philosophy that might not be in line with your own.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much to it, but I think what because I think we should clarify about what parasites we're also talking about, isn't it? Because I think there's a lot, but the main ones that I think obviously get spoken about the most are fleas, ticks, giardia. Is that how you say? Everyone says it different. Some people say giardia, some people say I'm going with giardia. Um, Intestinal worms and heartworm, that's more of a problem for you guys than it is for us in the UK, but they're the kind of general ones that we're talking about. And within the worms, there's many different little varieties, but that intestinal worm issue, they're the ones that we're talking about. And all of them are an annoyance to a certain degree. But again, when I went down my little research hole, this does come into the whole fetch thing as well, but it's just I would invite everyone to think about what role those parasites play within their own ecosystems, just as an invitation, because that starts to change the conversation as well. So we'll dive into that in a bit deeper in a little while, but it's just to start thinking about that they play a role in an ecosystem, and that we need to be conscious of that. I think as we think about what they aren't just there to annoy us.
Exactly. No, and you had, I'm looking for specifically, it was some of the intestinal worms that you had found in your research too, that there are positive effects, which include like actually helping to regulate the immune system, that they may reduce certain types of cancer, that they can actually help with autoimmune conditions. So this kind of points to something as well that I think, as we're starting this conversation and working through into how we approach this from the fetch lens, I was reading, who was it? It was I'm gonna find his name. I've heard it through a few different vets, but there was a particular vet, I think it was Dr. Gary Dupree, who had said like there is essentially like there's a difference between having parasites and having a parasite burden. We talk about it within like the heartworm context that Dr. Will Falconer talks about. There's a difference between your dog having heartworms and having heartworm disease.
Yeah.
Right? Having these parasites is totally normal. And actually, a client of mine once asked me, like, are we supposed to get rid of all of the worms? Is it possible that they still have worms? She was a little freaked out about the possibility of the dog having worms. And I said, yeah, yeah, we have worms. Like all of us, everything has these parasites. That's normal. They play an important role in the body and in the wider ecosystem, like you're saying. But where we get concerned, and really the conversation that we're having when we're talking about parasites, is when, like with the microbiome, when the quote unquote pathogenic bad guys take over, when there's an imbalance. Something, though, has led to that imbalance where these parasites can take over. It's the taking over that is the problem. It's
Okay.
not them in and of themselves. And I think that's an important thing to kind of lodge in our minds as we're thinking about this.
And what's happened within your dog's ecosystem to allow that burden to happen? What's
Yeah.
happened, whether from a microbiome, from from all the other things that we'll cover through the F.E.T.C.H framework, but it's what has gone wrong in that ecosystem to allow that other ecosystem in, or to create that imbalance. See, there's so many rabbit holes.
It's so good.
This is huge.
It's huge, but to your point, I mean, it's similar to how we talked about yeast as well in that episode. We can
But
leave a
it's
link to
normal.
it. It's a normal thing. Your dog, every dog, we have yeast, like it's a normal thing. The problem is when there's an imbalance. But it's always when we're talking about in dogs with yeast, where it needs to be spoken about as a yeast overgrowth. It's the overgrowth that's a problem,
Yeah.
but it's not actually the primary problem. Yeast overgrowth is a secondary problem. So we have to look at as to Stacey's point, what underlying issue is there that has allowed this overgrowth to happen? That same question can be applied when we're starting to think about parasites too. And really the concern becomes then the diseases that they can carry or what have you. Like what are the ramifications of the burden of parasites? That there's a primary issue, that the parasite is not the primary issue. They're really the secondary issue. So again, another thing to have in your head as we're talking about.
I hope you've got a notebook while everybody's
I
watching
know,
this, like
I
just for
know.
questions and prompts. Like, what was that question they said I needed to ask myself?
Exactly. I also thought it would be helpful for us to kind of talk about when we're talking about the preventative drugs, for example, that first of all, nothing is 100% effective. Not just with like the drugs, with everything. Nothing is 100% effective. So nothing is a complete safeguard, and nothing works. There's no one thing that works for every single dog. So even with the conventional and the holistic approaches, this is going to be about figuring out what's right for your dog. But we often talk about how the term preventative is a bit of a misnomer when it comes to the conventional stuff. Do you want to talk a little bit about maybe what's actually going on with those drugs, how they're working?
Well, yeah, because you think about that, when you actually look at what the wording is on a lot on them, they are treatments for those parasites. They aren't actually designed to prevent them. So the problem is that we're giving a treatment for something that doesn't need to be treated as a prevention, and that to me just doesn't seem to kind of stack up or make much sense. So and when you read the inserts, and I've read a lot of inserts for these treatments just because I want to read the data sheet, and it's always treatment of this worm, treatment of this tick, treatment. You're like, but that we're not aiming for a treatment right now, because aren't we trying to prevent them? So it's almost like it just doesn't work because you're
Mm-hmm.
thinking about it from the wrong perspective. Like, and I always kind of frame it in the fact that with children, we wouldn't put a NIT treatment on every month just because they might get NITs. We would treat them if they got them. It's just thinking about it differently and just kind of understanding what those pharmaceuticals are and what they were designed to do,
Mm-hmm.
which is to treat rather than prevent.
Exactly. Exactly. And they still only work when the dog has been bitten in the case of like the flea or the tick. So there's still that risk of disease transfer because they still have to bite. So they're not repelling. And I think that's another term too in the
Yeah,
parasite space, that those preventatives, and I'm actually going to stop calling them preventatives because they are just pesticides. We have to recognize they are just
yeah,
pesticides. They are not preventing anything and they're not repelling
yeah.
anything. So when you start to think about it that way, it might change the way that you're thinking about how you would use them, that they would be used as a treatment, as Stacey's saying. And for the most part, they're neurotoxins. So they're designed to disrupt the neurology of the parasite. But guess what? They can do that to your dog too.
If it's meant to disrupt their nervous systems, then common sense would just lead you to the conclusion that that could then have the same impact on your dog.
But not just common sense, like there it's documented that this is what happens. So when again to Stacey's point of reading those inserts, when you do read those inserts or you go on the FDA's website to see the various cases that have been brought against a lot of these drugs and the requirement for these companies to actually state what is going on, we see things like seizures, we see like ataxia, we see all kinds of neurological disorders as a result. Not death can even be a risk. Now, again, there's a risk with anything and everything, right? So this is how do you evaluate your risk? But I think we need to understand that this isn't a risk-free thing of giving your dog these pesticides, right? I think that's an important thing to kind of hammer home.
Yeah, and I mean, my whole journey with these started with a spot on treatment on Shadow, and interesting, I had this conversation with somebody else only last week that they had had the same experience that I had. So as a dutiful owner, when Shadow came home, he'd gone and had his vaccinations. He'd got a worming tablet, and I was given a spot on treatment. So this was all on the first day that we'd picked him up. So I'd put the spot on treatment on his neck. He'd gone and laid down on my leather sofa, rolled over, slept for about 2 hours. Then he got up, and I realised that there was a hole missing in my leather sofa, like where he'd laid, where the liquid from his neck had gone onto my leather sofa, and I'm like, what? He hasn't scratched it, and it took me like 5 minutes to actually kind of join the dots. Like, how if that's doing that to my leather sofa, what the hell is that doing to my puppy? And I was like, right, you're having a wash, and now I know that it won't have done it won't have done a lot to have got it off, but there was, I was trying to get some of it off. But then I had a conversation with someone else the other week who had exactly the same experience, and that's what led them to stop using the spot-ons, because they realised that it had marked that their sofas, they had a leather sofa too. And when you think what leather is, it's skin. It is what that is. It's terrifying.
Yeah, it is
And
terrifying.
I'm not saying that to kind of scare people. It's more just to get that thought in your head that that's what they have the potential to do. And if that's seeping through into bloodstream, once it's gone through the skin and it's gone through the tissue, that's the only reason that the fleas would die, is because they're biting and they're ingesting those neurotoxins, and then they die. But they, like you said, they've still bitten. It doesn't actually make them go, oh no, I'm not going to go near that dog, because they will still jump on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's just a very different kind of approach to those kinds of treatments. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, they are scary.
They are. And I think that's what a lot of pet parents are actually afraid of, that we know that they're not necessarily great, but we don't necessarily know what to do about it. But I think understanding what's actually going on with those drugs, how they're performing, how they're actually working, can help you navigate whether or not that's an appropriate risk for you to take. And also reframing the language around preventatives, when you start to look at they're not actually preventing. So what can I do to prevent? If I want to stop these things coming onto my dog, how do I do that? And so that is a bit of what we're going to walk through with you today, because it's all well and good to say like these things are toxic and they're terrible and all of that stuff, but what are you left to do? How do you navigate this? So we want to make sure that you feel comfortable, that you've got some resources to start working through this for yourself. But I also wanted to say as well, I was reading through something that Rita Hogan had written about fleas, and she has a whole course that you can take
Mm.
on fleas, which I recommend if that's like a particular interest of yours, you've got a particular problem around that. But she was actually saying, similar to what we are, that having some fleas is actually totally normal. But we're taught, oh my God, if my dog has a flea, there's a huge problem and this is going to like blow up into something huge and, all of that. And so I think remembering again that this is all part of the normal way of being with your dog. But if you have, my experience has been with Lucky, because he has had a few fleas on him, but we've never had a flea outbreak. Never. And in part, I am convinced it's because I bolster his whole immune system, but I also take a multi-layered approach. especially during high flea season, where I'm looking at where am I taking him? I'm managing the environment. I'm also, in his case, I'm putting on appropriate essential oils onto a bandana that attaches to his collar when we go out, for example, and then I remove it when we come back in. There are different ways that you can start to approach this so that I can avoid giving him those tablets or the spot-ons and actually prevent.
Yeah, so that they don't actually jump on because, and I think that goes back to some of the other research when we were talking about the ecosystems and stuff, that they serve a purpose within that ecosystem, and that, it was saying about that they will take out weak animals in populations of animals. That's part of their job. That's their job within the ecosystem, because then that will feed another something, and that when they fed, they will be food for birds. They will help decompose matter in the ground, and they have jobs to do. And when you reframe what they're doing in that way, it kind of changes that thing, like that we've just got to ban them from the earth. Like, well, no, because actually they've got a job, they are doing something, so let's not be scared of that. But how do we just not invite them into our home? How can we just kind of support our dogs to not be so attractive to them?
Right. Exactly.
That means being healthy. And where does that
Exactly.
start? How do we create that health and look at it from using health as prevention?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so much of this kind of comes down as well to ensuring that your dog has a healthy immune system so that there isn't a parasite burden. So again, your dog can have heartworms, but you don't want it to develop into heartworm disease. And how you do that is make sure that you bolster the immune system so it can deal with it. And I mentioned Dr. Will Falconer because he has a heartworm specific course and ebook on his natural approach to something like heartworm that he developed when he was living in Maui, which has a very high heartworm rate, as well as in Texas, which is also a high heartworm area. And I got interested in this because living in Mexico, where there's high heartworm as well, it was like, well, am I just sort of doomed to have to use the heartworm preventatives, for example? Like, how do I weigh this risk up? And so I got his book and was reading through it to better understand what's actually going on with something like heartworm, and understanding something like the fact that, you know, the way that it's transmitted, which in the case of heartworm is through mosquitoes. It has to have been like the mosquitoes have to have mated within a certain period of time. It has to be a female mosquito that's bitten, that has to have had the larva at a particular stage. When you start to look at these things, it's like, actually, the risk might not be as high as I'm thinking it is. And his big thing is like when you're giving the pharmaceutical quote unquote preventatives, when you're just pumping the dog full of those pesticides, you're weakening the immune system so that they can't actually fight something off. And so he also turns to looking at the rates of some of these diseases in wild canine populations. So looking at like foxes and wolves and what have you, to get a better sense of they're outside all the time and they don't receive this stuff, and how many of them are actually die from the parasite. Very, very small percentage. To Stacey's point, it will take out the weak ones, like the sick, the old ones, that kind of a thing. But for most of the population that is healthy, they might still have something like heartworms or intestinal worms, but that's not what kills them. And I think that's an important reframe too, like as we're thinking
There's
about this.
that I was watching a documentary once on different canid species across the world, and there was one species I can't remember. I'll try and find the link. It was a BBC documentary. I'll to put in the show notes, but it was fascinating. But there was one dog that one canid species, had really long legs. It was almost like a hyena, but it wasn't. But it had really long legs, and
Oh,
they
was it
would
an
eat.
African painted dog?
No, it wasn't
No,
from Africa. I'm
that
pretty sure it
wasn't.
was South America. That's the
Oh,
bell
okay.
that's ringing. But incredible. But they would eat specific, if they knew that they had worms, they would go and eat a specific fruit because they knew that that would clear them out.
Yeah,
Like they know
yeah,
and that's we that's how they protect themselves. That's their prevention.
Yeah.
Well, no, that's the treatment, I
It's a
suppose, isn't it?
treatment.
They're doing it the other way around. They're like, well, I haven't got them, so I won't eat it. Oh, I have got them, I'll eat it. Then they get rid of them, so we're done.
Yeah.
It's yeah, they know. They're so clever.
They're so much more in tune with it, with their own systems. And this is also the benefit of practicing self-selection with your dog as well, offering them different things so that they can choose what it is that they need at any particular time. And if you know, for example, that we're coming into flea season, flea and tick season or whatever, offering them things that can be supportive of that and see if they choose it.
Absolutely.
I
And I
love it.
think just going back to the kind of pesticide aspect of it, just remembering that the microbiome is what 70-80% of the immune system. And if we've got those pesticides going in on a monthly basis, what that is doing to the microbiome in the same way that antibiotics will have an impact on it. So that to speak to that point of Dr. Faulkner saying that, you know, you're just constantly kind of napalming the gut microbiome once a month. So how does the immune system recover from that? It can't necessarily. You
Right.
potentially you can if you're doing a detox protocol alongside something like that. But if you're not, what impact is that having? So it is that whole knock-on effect of
Yeah.
those preventions, which we've now realized aren't preventions, they're treatments, but we're not actually treating anything, but actually we're knocking out the one big defense system that your dog has naturally got to help actually prevent them.
Right.
You're taking that out with a treatment that for something they don't have. So
Right.
it's just a whole nother side of that discussion as well, isn't it? When you start adding in the microbiome layer to it from the immune system perspective, it's massive.
Absolutely. No, 100%. And also for something like Lyme disease, I was reading about how really and that's a big fear for people when it comes to ticks. I think that and like Ehrlichia are probably like the biggies when it comes to ticks. But with something like Lyme disease, it's only, I want to say it's like 1% of this 1% chance when you look at the number of ticks that actually have it and how they can pass it on and all that kind of stuff. It ends up being about like a 1% chance that your dog can get Lyme disease, which again, you don't want your dog to have Lyme disease. So I get that, like how you end up weighing that up. But the way that Lyme disease really develops and whether or not your dog gets sick from Lyme disease or whether or not it's just sort of in its system for a little bit depends upon other cofactors. So this is where looking at evaluating other aspects that's going on with your dog's health, but also if you can really bolster the immune system, they can come into contact with a lot of these things and not necessarily develop the disease state. So that's another way of thinking about it. How do you manage the potential cofactors that could lead to your dog actually developing disease state?
Yeah, and supporting the immune system to do the job that it was designed to do, to be that defense system, and that's unique to your dog, like that it's designed for your dog to support your dog. So how do we do that?
Yeah,
With the F.E.T.C.H framework. That's how we
exactly.
do that.
Well, exactly. I was going to say, do you want to start walking through like, so how would we approach this with Fetch and how can people start to think about it as they evaluate their own situation?
Yeah, so if we look at the fresh food, the first part, then um the I've really lost my train of thought with that then, didn't I? But
You're doing great.
fresh food. This is where we can really use food to support the immune system, because if we're using a fresh species appropriate diet and we can get that stuff in to support the microbiome, which then supports the immune system, again, it's that knock-on effect and a layered approach essentially, isn't it? Because we're by feeding fresh food, it's species appropriate and we're going to support the microbiome. So, and then you can include foods as well, like garlic, thyme, oregano. I mean, they're great for the microbiome as well, but they're also great repellents.
Mhm.
So again, you can use food to support the system and help be a preventative rather than treatment.
Yep,
So
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. And just a side note about garlic that because this comes up a lot. People are like, wait,
Oh,
you can feed
you said
garlic?
garlic.
You said garlic. Yes, you can
I'm
feed
sick.
Garlic is actually medicinal in nature. It's a fantastic food for your dogs, with some exceptions. So we don't want to feed it to puppies under 6 months of age. We don't want to feed it to lactating and pregnant dogs. And we want to avoid it with some of the Japanese breeds like Shibas and Akitas because they have a real problem with processing it. One of the concern around garlic is its impact on blood cells, red blood
Yeah.
cells.
Yeah.
And
And
it
if
has
I
a
think if they're on blood thinners and any other treatments for stuff like that as well, you need to be careful. But yeah,
yeah.
it's
Yeah, so you can look that up, and that is also part of evaluating your dog's risk is whether or not they could have that. But we can point you in the direction of for information on that, so you can evaluate that. But yeah, adding in all of that kind of stuff is a fantastic thing. Also, fermented foods, which are great for the microbiome, but also adding in some things, even as a treatment, not just a prevention, but also as a treatment. Fresh food can be really helpful. Things like grated and shredded vegetables and fruits can actually help push things through. Foods like pineapple for the digestive enzyme bromelain, and papaya with papain, which I always, it's like,
okay.
it's too many papaya with
Pa,
papain.
pa, pa, pa.
Those are really great. Pomegranate is known for
Love
being
that.
really helpful with something like tapeworms, right? So there are some fresh food options that you could even use medicinally. Pumpkin seeds is another one. I know that sometimes gets debated. I've personally had really good luck
Yeah.
with pumpkin seeds when I did a move, and so we'll talk about some of the other impacts that can create the opportunity for parasites to take over. I did a move, and Lucky was really freaked out, and so he ended up getting worms, having a little bit of a burden. And I had an interesting conversation with my vet who was like, okay, so now you need to put him on this, next guard spectre or whatever. And I said, I'm going to go ahead and try the natural route for a little bit. It should be noted that the natural route can take some time. It's not an overnight sort of thing. So just as an FYI, but we tested him after 7 days. He had fewer worms, but he did better. And then after about, I think it was 12 days or so, we tested him again. He was completely clear. So that opened her eyes up too, like, oh, there's another route. And I know you had
Easy.
an issue with Ted too under similar
Yeah,
circumstances.
so I do every 4 months I have a worm count kit just get delivered to my door. I've got it on subscription so I don't forget it. And it just comes in, I collect 3 days worth of poo and it just gets sent off and they screen it. And I've been doing that for about 7, 8 years. And in November last year, Ted had his first ever low worm count for hookworm. And it's really weird because when the results came in, it's almost like I was expecting something. There was, and weirdly before the day before I got the results, I'd started him on a detox protocol because my brain had gone, actually, we've had a really stressful few months. My husband's been away. He's been very unsettled. He's been stressed. So we'll do a bit of a detox. Then I get the positive worm count. I was like, ah. So again, it was the stress. So his immune system had been lowered because of the stress. And now in hindsight, there's some things that I would have done differently, a little bit more vitamin C and a few more bits and pieces that I would have done to support him, but I hadn't quite joined those
Mhm.
dots. But I treated him for 10 days with grapefruit seed extract, the drops, and I treated him for 10 days and tested again 3 weeks later, all clear.
He's good.
So
Yeah.
and that's twice I've used that. For Shadow had them once and I did it with that, and Ted's had them once. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
but again, for me, that's why the screening particularly, this is probably a little bit further down, but the screening is really helpful because it just gives you that security in thinking that
Yeah.
you're kind of keeping on top of it and just keeping an eye on what's going on in there. And that then you
Exactly.
can get in quicker to do a treatment,
Yeah,
an actual
exactly.
treatment.
Exactly. No, exactly. And to pick up on that for something like heartworm too, that's one of the things that's recommended. If you're going to go a natural route, you just check. You do your tests. You're supposed to do your tests before every year before you start any kind of pharmaceutical heartworm preventative anyway. But you just test more often to see how they're doing and you catch something. And with something like heartworm as well, this is kind of part of evaluating your risk. It actually takes months for it to start developing. So you have time. Time is on your side in that sense. It's not like you've got to make a decision right there and then, like you can actually deal with it um, over a period of time. But so that's as we move then from, is there anything else for fresh food that you think is
No, I
helpful?
think
So I think that's pretty good.
some of those herbs and some of the just supporting the herbs, the seeds, some of those other good bits. Yeah, lovely.
Yep.
Get 'em
And
in.
bone broth.
Well, that's that's just part of life now, isn't
That is a part of
it?
life now, but in all seriousness, it's such an incredible. I don't like using the term superfood, but for dogs, I would say it is like a superfood, especially for supporting the immune system. And you can start including, you started doing this too, including specific herbs in the bone broth that you're making. So if you want to add in some thyme or whatever, or garlic to help kind of ward off um, fleas and all that kind of stuff, you can add it into the broth.
Yeah, and boost the microbiome at the same time.
Yeah,
Winner, winner. I mean, you can't
exactly.
really go wrong, can
And it
you?
smells delicious. So,
It
yeah,
does.
exactly.
Really do. That last batch I did, oh my God, it smelled so good.
Delicious. But then when we start to look at energetics, there are a couple of things that I would point out with this. And one is it goes back to the fresh food portion. We bang on about this quite a bit. Knowing your dog's energetics is going to be such a game changer, even if it's just knowing whether or not their energetics from the perspective of if they are warm or if they are cool. And if you don't know what your dog's energetics are, we have a free PDF that walks you through how to figure that out and how you can feed to support your dog's energetics. So we'll leave a link to that in the show notes. But when you start to look at energetics, feeding your dog according to their energetics so that you're not pushing them towards the disease state, right? If you've got a warm dog, disease state starts, chronic inflammation starts when they're pushed towards the hot end. For a cool dog, it's the opposite. When they're pushed towards the cold end of the spectrum, that's when their disease state starts. So you want to keep everything kind of like in the more neutrally kind of area. So if you know your dog's energetics, you can better choose foods that will support that. But also, everything has an energetic profile. Absolutely everything. So things like essential oils are going to have an energetic profile. Me mentioning that I put them on Lucky's bandana, I need to be cognizant of him as a cool dog. What are the energetics of the essential oils that I'm adding onto that? Because not only is it touching him on his fur and going on his skin, but also when you're smelling that, that is a form of medicine. That's aromatherapy, right? So I have to be cognizant of the fact that his body is going to have to process that. So that's another layer of thinking about energetics. Anything you want to add about that?
No, I think and I think as well because with energetics, it's just important to think about that, particularly as we come into the warmer seasons when the parasites, fleas and ticks, particularly in heartworm, are more prevalent. That we're aware of our dog's energetics at that time. So for me, for example, Teddy's is a hot. I would say he's more warm now than hot. I've got him out of that kind of hot state, but he's a warm boy. So over the winter, I can give him those warm proteins. But come April, May time, as temperatures start picking up, I will drop most of those out. He'll still get some occasionally, but much smaller portions, and his diet will predominantly be more cooling proteins whilst he's going through those summer months. So we don't want it. We don't. It's ideal to be using energetics seasonally because then we don't. But they've got the potential to push into those disease states if we're feeding a hot dog hot proteins during hot weather. That's just a recipe
Right,
for heat.
right.
So it's an ideal time to start looking at a diet when we're moving into a different temperature, particularly if we're going to go into silly summer temperatures. Not that we get that in the UK. It's not something we have to worry about.
But it's true, you do have to consider it. And I think, one of the guiding questions with traditional Chinese medicine anyways is like in relation to what? So that's when you start looking at like in relation, like what is the weather like? Or, even in the summer, for example, if it's a hot summer, but your dog is primarily staying in cold air conditioning, right? That
Yeah,
you might actually need some more warming proteins, for
yeah,
example. Like so it's asking that in relation to what constantly. And when we're going, like Stacey was saying, when we're going through key obvious changes, like kind of transition points like a season or whatever, those are ideal times to start asking that and then make modifications
yeah.
as necessary.
And that kind of that's targeted a little bit, I
Yeah.
suppose, as well, isn't it? Because
Go
that's
into
when
it.
you're actually
Yeah.
targeting for your dog. But I think what's really a really important question to be asking is about if you are choosing to use pharma, for example, that do you need to use it all the year round? Because where is the risk? So the targeted bit is really where you can start to evaluate your risk and what you feel comfortable with in using. So, for example, do you need to use a tick treatment all the year round? Probably not, because although I see a lot of debate online at the moment that, you know, the temperatures haven't got cold enough, so they're still around, but they're less likely to be around. Because what's it what's the figure? There is a figure, isn't there? If it gets below, is it
Yeah,
50,
it's for I've seen it for mosquitoes. I think it's like, is it
59?
54? Is it 54 if I done my little dyslexic
But
inverting
it's
thing?
somewhere in that region, isn't
Yeah,
it? So that's mosquitoes, but I think it's a similar thing for,
similar thing.
yeah. Um, but the likelihood is they will be less during the winter and the colder months,
Yep.
particularly if you're, I mean, if you're in Canada, definitely. If you're UK, where we're just wet all the time anyway, so it doesn't matter. But um, yeah, it's just whether you need to use them all year round, or do you just want to use them during the height of the seasons, kind of like March to September time, and then you know that you're giving your dog's body a break from those pharmaceuticals for the other 6 months. So that's when you could do a detox protocol alongside when you're treating them, and then you can let the body do the rest of the time. Um, and what else did oh, and the testing, of course, that's a really targeted approach. If the poo samples, it's so easy to do, and for me the cost is equal to doing a monthly plan with my vet for doing like the pack of the tablets and the Woma tablet and the flea and tick. The cost is comparative. There's
Hmm.
not much in it. So for me, it just makes sense just to test.
Yeah.
But we did find somewhere in America that was doing them, didn't we, when we were looking yesterday? The
Yeah, I
worm
think there
counts.
are a
Yeah.
couple of companies, but I think it's mostly done at your vet. It's something that you can ask them for, where again, you would take in a poo sample to the vet and they would just look at it under the microscope to count eggs is basically what they're doing, or seeing if there's
Yeah.
any larvae. And the same for a heartworm test. It's generally a blood test that you would have done at your vet, where they are looking for an antigen that I think it's the female mosquito larvae emits into the bloodstream. So that would be something that, but you have to request those tests. So again, this is part of the F.E.T.C.H approach of being aware of what is out there that you can then ask for. So if your vet is recommending, if you're in a high heartworm area, and that is a concern, and your vet would have that kind of concern, ask them to test first. And that's an automatic thing. You would want to have them tested before you even start them on any kind of chemical preventative. And if they're negative, and then you can look at different options. And again, that might be that you do choose that having the pharmaceutical approach is what is right for you. I know that Dr. Judy Morgan was talking about this a couple of years ago, and I asked her on her Facebook page. She was doing some chats about heartworm and stuff, and I asked her specifically what she was now doing about this, because she had been living up in New Jersey and moved down to North Carolina, sorry, which totally different climates, right? And there's a much higher risk of heartworm where she is now. And I asked her, what is she doing for her dogs? Like, how did she make this decision? For her, she said she wasn't at this time, and again, don't quote on all of this. This was what she said to me a couple of years ago. She may have changed her mind, like disclaimer on all of that. But she had said that she wasn't doing anything for her dogs because, again, evaluating the level of risk, her dogs are mostly indoor dogs. Her daughter, on the other hand, Gwen, who lives near her, she does use a heartworm preventative, but she was using one that doesn't have the flea and tick stuff added into it. So she was mitigating that way with in a way that felt good for her because her dog was spending more time outdoors. So you can do kind of combo factors.
And I think that's the other thing as well, is looking to see whether you can break out, because a lot of the meds now are just, they're all in one. It's like, we'll just make your life really easy, so we'll just put everything in one. But if you only want the heartworm component, you can just get a heartworm one versus having to go for everything. So again, that's kind of the targeted bit. How do you want to use those options that are available to you to only deal with the one that you have the highest level of risk for? there are options. There are other ways of doing it. You don't have to do the all in ones. So it's just
Exactly.
another way of looking at it, isn't it? And another kind of question to ask and speak with your vet about. Is there another option? Do I have to use that? Or is there one just for heartworm? Is there
Yep.
one just for fleas? Or, whatever the one is that you want to deal with, there's another way.
Exactly. Exactly. And as Stacey was alluding to as well, also within the targeting, adding, if you do go down the pharma route, make sure that you're adding in an appropriate detoxing protocol as well. I know for the heartworm stuff that in one of her earlier books, Dr. Karen Becker had mentioned, she had suggested that for a week after giving the heartworm treatment that you also give milk thistle. But if you listen to my recent conversation with Dr. Katie Woodley as well, where we're talking about skin and gut issues, but she talks about the detox process and different parts of the detox process and how you might want to add something in like beetroot, for example, to help with one stage of the detox process, in addition to something like milk thistle. So you can kind of do a combination factor. I'll leave a link to that episode as well if you haven't listened to that, because I think that part of it is super helpful for thinking about all detoxing of everything, right? Like how we start to think about this. But that's how you can start to target. And it's also part of, I mean, I think this sort of falls under the H, but I'm going to mention it here. We were talking about, you mentioned stress for Ted affecting him with him getting worms. Same thing for Lucky. I think something that you and I had been mentioning before we started recording that also gets overlooked with all of this stuff is our emotions. We know that our stress, so I would add on to what you were saying about Ted and this sort of stress of the environment, but your stress that you were personally going through with all of that too, because he's so connected to you, that would be feeding into his experience
And
of it, you know? But when we are, I'll speak to my personal experience of this, but I believe that many of us go through this because I've heard listeners have said, I'm concerned about, I don't like giving the flea tick heartworm tablets because they're poison. I feel sick giving them, but I don't know what else to do. Okay. I went through this kind of debate with myself with Lucky. Again, when I was in Mexico and in a high heartworm place, I bought into, oh my God, he can't get this disease. It's going to kill him. I need to be super vigilant. And actually, I was just going through his vaccination card the other day where they had put in like all the flea and tick treatments that he'd gotten. I was like, oh my God. Looking back, I was so vigilant about it. But something happened for me where it no longer felt like a good thing that I was doing for him. I switched energetically and felt sick about giving them to him. But because I'm into all the energy work, I'm into all the mystic stuff, I was aware how detrimental, not so much the drug, but my energy, my belief about that was to him. And that was the point I stopped, because I stopped feeling like I was doing a good thing for him and started feeling like I was poisoning him. So being cognizant of what your energy is, your take on this that you're putting onto the drug. If you feel after going through the process of evaluating your risk that you need to give, in this case, the heartworm pill, can you bless it? As silly as that might sound to some people, but like, can you come in again instead of a state of fear? Because I had shifted from love to fear. That's why I stopped. But if you can actually bring love back into that and realize that you are doing the absolute best that you can, and you bless it and you imagine that going into your dog's body and radiating love, that's a very, very different experience with these drugs. And your dog's body will know that difference. So that's another way that you can target.
and you will be feeling different about it, so that the dog will be feeling different about it, because it's almost like a double whammy of fear, isn't it? Because you've got a fear of them getting heartworm, for example, but then you've got a fear of using the treatment as well. So you've just got all this fear around one subject, and the dog is picking up on both sets of fear, how you're feeling, then they have the med, and if you're feeling sick about them having it, then the likelihood is that they may then be sick, or there's some GI issues. There's a lot of dogs that seem to present with GI issues, and I wonder whether that's a reflection of how the guardian is feeling when they're giving them, because they're like, I don't like doing it, but I know I have to. That kind of feeling that goes into it. It's just another frame, isn't it? It's just another reframe, sorry, of just how we could look at doing those things differently and
Mm-hmm.
coming at it from another one, as the Course in Miracles would say, I choose to see this differently. I choose to see this pharmaceutical differently right now, and this is for the highest good of me and my dog right now, because of the situation we're in or whatever's happened. This is the situation.
Yeah,
So
100%. And it's another way of taking back control,
mhm.
and feeling like you have, yeah, that you just have more control over this sort of situation. So if that feels resonant, run with that and see how you feel with that. But that's another way of kind of targeting dealing with this stuff too. But we'd also made mention, I'm just running through our list of some things that we wanted to tell you about, like using a multi-layered approach as well, where maybe you're putting a spray, an appropriate essential oil spray on your dog, something like Kid and Kind, that's very popular in the States, and I think it's in the UK as well. Is that right? Can you get
Think
that?
so. Yeah, I've used one called Chambers before for fleas and ticks here in the summer, but I now not using essential oil sprays for Ted because he's had some seizures over the last year. So I'm choosing, because they are, as Alexia mentioned, they are medicine. You're breathing them in, they are a medicine, and I'm just wanting to reduce any potential impact on Ted's, particularly from a kind of neurological perspective. I just want to minimize that risk, so I'm choosing not to use those this year. So I won't be, normally I'd be stocking up by now, ready to start next month, but they're not going to be in Ted's regime this year. So I'm adapting and changing to Ted as an aging dog and things that are presenting and how I'm going to navigate that this year. So my focus will be his immune system.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to do everything that I can through his diet and some supplements and whatever support the holistic vet gives him to support his immune system, so that we can come at it from that perspective, rather than using the essential oils just because there can be links with seizures. So I just want to be careful, and I don't want him to have any more than necessary. Ideally, I don't want to have any more, but
Right.
I don't want to potentially add fuel to that fire. So
Right.
we're going to take those off the regime this year. So it's just
Exactly.
another thing to be mindful of. If you've had a dog that's had seizures, then essential oils I would be careful with, or work with someone that is trained
Yeah.
in with the aromatherapy oils and can be very sure about the different energetics of them and your
Yeah.
dog. Because
Yeah.
again, they will have different reactions with your dog, so they need to know your dog to be able to advise which ones would be best. And that's where you can start building your team around you, and that's just one of
Exactly.
those other wonderful team members you can have.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's so valuable. And having somebody who's not only trained in it, but could also help you with the self-selection aspect of it too, if that's an option, so that your dog can guide you with through all of this. But if
Yeah,
you
because they
can't,
know which ones will be okay.
exactly, exactly. And if you can't use essential oils, I know that there are sonic tags for fleas and ticks that work for some people, amber collars as another
Yeah.
example, using no-sodes as an alternative to vaccines as well to help bolster the immune system, that kind of a thing. So there's loads of things that you can be doing in order to take a more targeted, multi-layered approach.
And just being aware of the full moon as well,
Well, this is curiosity. Go for it.
yeah, because there is some links with parasites and full moons, so it's a great time, just to keep it in your diary, just to be aware of when the full moon is, and for a few days either side, that's maybe when you top up on the pumpkin seeds, for example, and just think about how that can be part of your multi-layered approach as well, that we're considering all aspects that could be impacting our little doggos in our life.
Absolutely. And that's not woo, by the way. Like that is
Yeah,
scientifically
that's
proven that,
science.
yeah,
That's
parasites
yeah.
are more active at the full moon, like around 3 days of the full moon as well. So if you kind of think of that week, that might be the week that you are bumping up all of your prevention kind of stuff. Absolutely. And
Mhm.
then I'm just kind of looking through what I think we've covered.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, we
uh, though what we were talking about too about stress and stuff, so making sure that you're also taking a note of your dog's mental and emotional health, like are they getting appropriate enrichment, what are their stress levels, all of that kind of stuff is going to affect their overall health, which makes them more or less susceptible to parasite burden.
And I think that leads really nicely into the how do you assess your risk? Like what is, and I think that's probably one of the biggest takeaways we were hoping people would get from this, isn't it? That how do you assess your risk? So for me, it would be, so I would say that Ted's risk is probably quite high for fleas and ticks and worms because he likes to eat a bit of poo. Um, he is in the forest every day. He's got his head in a bush somewhere because he's a spaniel. He's in muddy water. He drinks muddy water. He's gross. He rolls. So for me, so I would say that his risk would be quite high if we were going to have a scale of 1 to 10. I'd probably put him at 9 or a 10 probably because of what he's exposed to. But because I said earlier that I want to work on his immune system, I come at it from the energy of the fact that his immune system is well supported, so therefore he's well supported to be able to deal with anything that he comes across. So even though his risk is high, I still don't feel fearful about that because he's a dog and he's
Mhm.
just doing his dog thing. So the enjoyment that he gets out of some of those things that he does bolsters his immune system because it creates happiness and he's fulfilling his dog needs and he's having those outlets. So I would say that that has a positive effect on reducing stress. So that's a good thing for his immune system. So I've flipped the fear into a positive thing, that actually all those things that potentially is making his risk higher is actually good for him because
Mhm.
it's bolstering his immune system. So it's another little reframe. So all this is reframe.
It is reframe. And again, like nothing is 100% effective. And there's a risk to just being alive, right? Like,
Walking out the door. Like,
yeah. And I think this kind of ties into a conversation that you and I have like privately quite often. And it's something that we are bringing into the fetch space, but it is about this idea of longevity and where we have become to a degree like so obsessed culturally with keeping our dogs alive for as long as possible and that's great. I mean, I'm not saying we don't want that. Of course, we want that. But we also have to evaluate the risks and the costs of that. So if we're denying dogs the opportunity to be dogs because we're afraid of something they may or may not pick up, is that that becomes a quality of life issue, right? Like we don't want to just keep them locked inside all day just to keep them safe. Like that's not okay either. So
in a
it's
fear
again,
bubble, that's just
totally,
not going to help, is it? It's just going
totally.
to create more potential issues. So
Yep.
yeah, if you've got a dog that is inside all the time, their risk in theory would be low, but if they ever had a chance to be exposed to something, potentially they are more likely to get something because their immune system isn't operate. They haven't been able to dig in the mud, and we know how beneficial digging in the mud is for the microbiome. Then inhaling in the VOCs and all that amazing stuff of actually just getting that stuff into the system is so good for them.
Mhm.
So that is yeah, reframe the potential bad into
Yeah.
something slightly more fun and nicer.
A hundred
Yeah.
percent. And when I was evaluating Lucky's risk, my main concern was heartworm. I was less concerned about fleas and ticks. I'm very fortunate that I mean, he's had a few fleas on him, and that's totally normal. And I've found ticks on him after we've come back from a walk, but they've not actually bitten him. They've just been on his fur, and I've taken them off. But my big thing was heartworm because of all the scaremongering of the whole industry, right? They also don't tell you that these mosquitoes are becoming resistant to the very drugs that we're giving them. That's part of the issue as well. And why they, when it's talked about, like there's an increasing problem with heartworm. Not so much that there's an increasing problem with heartworm, it's that they're resistant to it. So there is more of it being counted in a sense. But I think, like, in terms of how I was evaluating risk as well, like I said, I would do the essential oils on Lucky's bandana that he would wear when we would go out. I would always take that bandana off when we came home so it wasn't right next to his face the whole time. And then I also would have, like, for me it was potted plants, so you could put this in your garden, but I would look at naturally insect repelling plants and have them like around the door. So things like lavender, I mean even like all your like herby kind of things. That's all really good to have near your door and stuff. And also using neem oil and putting like neem powder on the garden is another. Oh, another thing you can do if you've got grass is using a garlic spray that you put on the actual lawn to kind of keep fleas and ticks away. You can also plant nematodes, which is like a little worm-like creature that eats fleas and ticks. So there are ways that you can kind of manage. That was how I was managing it. And like I said, keeping Lucky indoors at dawn and dusk when the mosquitoes were feeding. Did I see mosquitoes on him? Yeah. Yeah, he's been bitten by mosquitoes. But I didn't immediately go to, oh my God, he's going to have heartworm now. I've been very cognizant of managing that, and especially from my journey of him with kidney disease, when I was working through all of that, his kidney ailments. I don't even refer to it as kidney disease. He had an issue, right? And we cleared that up. But how important my energy was in dealing with that. And so I now apply that to everything. It doesn't mean that I'm blind and like I'm just totally ignoring these things or whatever. It's just like Stacey was saying, I take a different reframe and I test more often, and that makes me feel better. And I feel much better about not giving him those monthly pills. But again, that's going to depend on you and the other risk factors and what makes you feel good about it.
I've just suddenly thought about something that I say for Ted because he does pick up the occasional tick because, like I said, he has got his head in a bush all the time when we're out. And here we've got dog ticks and deer ticks, so there's a couple of different species. Are they species or types? I don't know. But I always say, "Oh, you've got a friend on you." I didn't realize until now that that's what I've called them. Oh, you've got a friend. Let's remove your friend. And most of the time, they are just crawling on his coat, and I can just take them off. But occasionally, one of them will have got through, and you'll be stroking his head, and it's usually around his ears. It's somewhere there because that's where he's gone like that. And I've only just suddenly thought I've always
Mhm.
called them. Oh, you've got a friend.
Yeah.
He's got a friend. We need to get his friend off. So
Yeah.
even that, I mean,
Yeah.
it's not he's not there to cause a problem. He's just a friend that needs to be evicted.
Exactly.
He just needs to be taken off. But I hadn't even thought about that. That's only literally just coming to my brain.
I love
That's so
it.
cool. I
It
like
is.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. It does.
cool.
It does. It totally reframes it. I love it. And I think that leads like really nicely into kind of like the whole, I mean, this is touching the whole prevention thing around how we're managing environment touches on the holistic kind of thing, but it's just having a completely different mindset to how we're approaching all of this and how we're seeing it and not immediately responding from that fear state. It's just so important. It's so important, you know?
Yeah.
But
And it
also,
just gives us another way of kind of thinking about it. And like we said at the beginning, it's a conversation that isn't happening. It's
mhm,
all or nothing. You're either completely farmer or you're completely holistic. There's, and if you
never the
choose to do
twain
one
shall
or the
meet, right?
other,
Yeah.
yeah, it just the lines get blurred and people get confused. And I think and even we found that, didn't we, when we were trying to bring together all the information. Even we were like, wow, there's a lot out there. Like that's a lot of information to take through. But actually, when you sit down and then kind of put it through the fetch lens, it starts to get a little bit clearer because you can target the bit that you need for your
Right.
dog. Because you can't do that with all the information. You just have to take those steps so that then you can figure out the end result once you've
Hmm.
figured out all the other bits and pieces. So, yeah, so cool.
It's so cool. It's so cool. And if you are resonating with this fetch approach and thinking about your dog's health in a different way, one, we absolutely invite you to come over and check out the membership where we are blending this evidence-based nutrition with spiritual wisdom and giving you a practical framework to work through with your dog for everything. We apply fetch to everything. And the idea is recognizing that every dog is an individual, every situation is individual. And so how do you take back your own power and make a decision for yourself confidently that you are doing the right thing for you and your dog, and whether that's being armed with the right questions to ask your vet and your other team, or knowing how to decide like which is the right food for your dog, and knowing what to do about the whole flea tick heartworm situation, that you do it from a place of love and confidence. that's what we're there to guide you with. But also, we have a PDF that we have created, a little ebook. We do.
Just because like I was saying, we got overwhelmed with the amount of information that's out there, and we know what we're kind of looking at, and oh, this is good, that's not, so that's why we created the PDF, because it to give you, to bring it all together using the Fetch lens and just creating different categories of where your risk is. So whether you think you're high risk, whether you think you're kind of medium risk, and whether you think your dog's low risk. So, and then what approaches you could take with each of those, because that's essentially what it boils down to. And it can be a little blend of everything. It can be, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You
Right.
can dabble.
Exactly.
If that's what
Exactly.
feels right.
Yeah.
If
And
that's what feels right for you. And it might be that if you know that you've got to use some of those treatments as well, if they're going to boarding or daycare, because some of them will require it. So there will be times that you might have to do that. But how can you do that coming from a place of love? And how can you do that coming from a place of what can I do to support their system if I'm having to do that? It can be
exactly.
done.
It can totally be done. And I think too, as we're so this sort of circles back to the whole conversation, or how we started the conversation with recognizing that these parasites are part of the ecosystem. And how do we start to ask some of these bigger questions as well about the role that these drugs are having on the environment, for example? And you made a really great statement of like, hold on a second. There's been research, there's been several studies that have come out, but there was one fairly recently about the declining songbird population in the UK as a result of the birds using fur to build their nests from dogs that had been treated with spot-on. So it had, because they were able to track the drug fipronil, and it was killing the chicks, or as I'm calling them, the chicklings.
Chicklings.
The little chicklings. It was killing the chicks. And so we're aware that there are these broader implications. And whilst you might feel like, oh my God, I care so much about the environment and I don't want this, but I also love my dog so much. How do I navigate this? How do I make these decisions? And this is part of how you can evaluate that. What is the right course of action for you?
Yeah, and I think it was when I was going, but hang on a minute as well. If the birds eat the fleas and
That's it.
ticks, but we're using something to kill them, then that's knocking another. So that if we're talking about ecosystems, then we're knocking another part of the ecosystem out, and that's a conversation to be had that I think isn't being had, or I haven't heard, because it literally just dawned on me. I was like, oh my goodness. So if we're using those to kill them, then that in terms of food source for the birds, we don't want to kill everything because we need them to have a food source.
Hmm.
So it's it's a bigger question. It's
Yeah,
a bigger discussion that we need to be having. And as part of that reframe, that everything fits into that system and we all cross over and it all overlaps. But how do we do that respectfully and kindly?
exactly. Exactly. So yeah, I think that kind of covers our parasite
I
discussion. Would
think
you
we've done
agree?
well.
Yeah, I
I
think we
think
did pretty
we have.
well.
I think
So
we've
if
done
you guys
well.
have any questions, if you want to kind of explore what this looks like in practice with us, come on over to the membership. We would absolutely love to have you there. You can find us at patreon.com/learnfetch. And you can get some information. You can join there's the free version, and then we also have the paid version where you get some more support, opportunities for monthly coaching calls where we can help support you specifically with your dog. So if you've got something you want to talk to us about, have us look at, we can help you with that. And we're very upfront with the fact that this is a brand new community that we're building, and we want it to be co-created with you. So if you're struggling with certain things with your dog and in your life with your dog, and you would like some support with particular things, let us know so we can build the appropriate resources, activities, opportunities, etc., to best help you with your
Speakers
dog.
and all of the other stuff that, I mean, we've got so many ideas, but we need to know whether they're the ones that you need. You need
Exactly.
to tell us.
Exactly. So I think that's probably does it. That's probably it for
think I
this
think we've
particular
yeah,
room.
I think we've
Yeah.
done well. Yeah.
Okay.
We
Sounds
just
good.
turned parasites on their head. So that's
Exactly. Exactly. Approaching loving parasites, not fearing them, right? Who knew? Who knew?
Yeah, that should be the title of the episode. Loving parasites, not bearing them. There you go. You've got that.
Exactly. Exactly. Thank you, everybody, so much. And we'll look forward to seeing you next month.
Yeah, indeed. Have a good one.
Bye. Thank you for joining Stacey and me for this month's Fetch First Friday, all about parasites. What was your biggest takeaway from this? Did it resonate with you? How do you evaluate your own dog's risk? We would love to know. Message me at Mystic Dog Mama on Instagram and tell us. Speaking of evaluating your dog's risk, if you're not quite sure how to do this or what things to consider and you're feeling a bit lost about what to do for your dog when it comes to parasites, Stacey and I have developed a Fetch Guide to Parasites that is designed to walk you through the process so that you can evaluate your own dog's risk, discover which approach feels best to you, and if you still have questions, which questions would be most helpful to ask your vet in order to get the information that you need to make the decision that is right for you and your dog. If this feels like it would be helpful to you, visit our Fetch shop at patreon.com/learnfetch/shop. Don't worry, I've left that in the show notes. You don't have to be a member to purchase this guide, but we would love to have you in our community. This guide is included in your membership in the paid tier, and if you're a member of our free tier, you get a 5% discount. Now, next month, our April Fetch First Friday episode, we're going to be talking about vegan food for dogs and lab-grown meat. If you've got any questions about these hot topics, send them our way. You can message me on Instagram at Mystic Dog Mama, leave a comment if you're listening on Spotify or watching on YouTube, or get in touch on my website, mysticdogmama.com, and let us know. We'll be happy to address them. Okay, on that note, until next time.